Okay, welcome. If this is your first AJR event, you are very welcome. I can see lots of familiar faces on the screen and lots of AJR members, but I can see a few people who I'm not sure if you have joined us before. I hope you can all hear clearly. For those of you who haven't joined us before, AJR is a national charity that deals with the welfare of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. If you're interested in reading more about our work, you can look on our website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. The event today will be recorded and will also be on our YouTube channel, where most of our Zoom events, our previous Zoom events, are also available for you to view again. I am delighted that we are joined today by David Nasaw, who is the author of, I want to get the title of your book correct, David, the author of The Last Million, and he will be joined in conversation by Martin Mauthner, who is a regular contributor to the AJR Journal, which is our monthly publication for those of you who are AJR members. David's book is available to buy through Amazon, and we will be putting the link on chat, but it is also available at all bookshops. So by all means, try to support your local bookshop, certainly in this day and age. At the end of the event, we will be taking questions through the chat facility, as the audience will be kept on mute. So any questions, please pop them on the chat facility, either during the conversation, or we will send out a little note when the conversation is reaching an end so that you can pop your questions on there. So David and Martin, thank you for joining us today. David, I know you're in New York, so it's a little bit earlier in the day for you than it is for us in the UK, but I know we have an international audience here today as well. So I'm going to hand over to the two of you. I'm going to spotlight you so you are on the screen. And thank you. We look forward very much to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you to all of those of you who are attending today. I'm sure it will be an interesting transatlantic Zoom. Since lockdown, I've attended many Zoom sessions, but this is the first time I find myself, so to speak, on the other side. And I'm honored that the AJR should have asked me to be your host and present our distinguished guest. David, speaking to us from New York, is an eminent American educator, scholar, and author. He's past president of the Society of American Historians, and he was professor of history at the City University of New York until he retired recently. Among David's published works are three well-received biographies. One is of the American press baron, William Randolph Hearst. Many link him to Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, and to the development of America's sensationalist so-called yellow press. The second deals with the Scottish-born Andrew Carnegie, who used the millions he made building up the US steel industry to promote peace in different ways. Carnegie funded my local public library with its delightful garden. And David's third life concerns Joseph Kennedy, father of JFK, and remembered over here as an undistinguished envoy to the court of St. James in the late 1930s. Ambassador Kennedy thought Britain was going to lose the war and favored appeasement and indeed negotiations with Hitler. David's new book is different. It's about the millions of DPs, displaced men, women, and children living in appalling conditions, whom the Allied armies came across as they occupied Germany. It's a complicated story with many conflicting interests at play. I think David does a brilliant job of helping readers grasp why, even if the war was over, it took more than 5 years before the last DP camps were closed. David, perhaps you could first explain how you came to write this book, as your earlier works deal with specifically American topics. I believe it was the London-born historian, Tony Judt, who inspired you. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I read Tony's book, Post-War, and was struck by his description of Europe after the end of hostilities in Germany. And in the chaos that Judd describes in Germany after the cessation of hostilities, there were 6 to 10 million foreigners who were stuck in Germany. They had come to Germany in a variety of ways, from a variety of places. They included forced laborers and slave laborers who the Germans had brought into Germany to do the work to keep the country going while millions of soldiers were on the Eastern Front. They included the displaced persons, Baltic refugees from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who had come into Germany at the end of the war because they did not want to remain in their homelands as the Red Army liberated them and as the Soviet Union annexed their homelands. And one of the reasons the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians escaped their homelands to Germany was that large numbers of them had been Nazi collaborators and war criminals. And they knew that when the Red Army returned and the war was over and the Nazis were expelled, they would be brought to justice. And the third group of the last million, who are the last refugees left in Germany, the third group were the Jews, the Jewish survivors of Dachau, of Buchenwald, of Bergen-Belsen, who, on liberation, those who were able to walk tried to go home to see if there was anyone remaining in their families. They walked, took trains, hitchhiked, stole places on army trucks to go back to Poland and Lithuania to look for survivors. My book is about the terrors, the horrors that were visited on the last million refugees who had no homes to return to, or for a variety of reasons, preferred not to return to their homelands when the war was over.
Could you show us a picture or two, perhaps, at this point?
Yeah, bear with me, everyone, please. This is a picture of the Latvians who are escaping to Germany at the end of the war. Now, when we look at this, we think, oh, the poor Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians. But if you compare their situation with that of the Jews, we see that they are in family groupings. We see that they have horses and wagons, which they will sell when they get to Germany. We see that they have their belongings, or at least whatever they can carry with them. Here is a photograph of a Polish family. Many among the large number of Poles who had, again, been brought into Germany to work the farms, the factories, the mines, the mills. They were treated as second-class citizens. They could not return home during the war. They were slave laborers. Here is another group of Poles who are awaiting transport to the displaced persons camps that the Allies set up. What is remarkable here is, again, we've all seen pictures of the Jews who come out of the camps. The Polish DPs, again, though they did not want to be in Germany during the war, they were relatively healthy. They were in good shape, certainly compared to the Jews. This is the burning of Bergen-Belsen. These are the British soldiers who were burning it after liberation. The inmates of the Bergen-Belsen camp had been moved down the road about a mile away from the concentration camp to the headquarters where the German guards, the German soldiers had lived. Immediately after the liberation of the inmates, typhus spread. The conditions were so absolutely appalling that the only way to stop the spread of typhus and other dangerous, germs and viruses was to burn down the entire camp. Here's a picture of one of the Jewish survivors arriving at a camp. Her belongings, which looks like a blanket and some clothes, she's put on top of a baby carriage, an abandoned baby carriage, and an American soldier is helping her wheel that carriage. Here's a picture of one of the thousands of Jewish infants who had been hidden away in some of the camps in Bergen-Belsen, but also with refugee families. And after the war, were discovered, and the Jewish agencies tried to enlist, to spread their pictures as widely as possible to find relatives who would take them in.
Is that it?
Well, we can go back later.
Oh, we'll go back to the pictures. All right. What I'd like to say to you now, you've got all these people in these camps, but they all in what becomes Western Germany. So the question is, we've got the Allies, the Russians, the Americans, the British, and so on, working together to defeat Hitler, which they succeed in doing. And you'd have thought that they would then be able to deal with the DPs jointly, and they set up a UN agency to do so. It doesn't work, does it? What happened?
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And almost immediately, the Soviets say, every refugee in Germany, except for the Jews, they make an exception for the Jews. Every refugee in Germany, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, should return home to help rebuild their devastated homelands. And if they don't go home, it's for one of two reasons. Because they're lazy and they want to get handouts from the Allies and be fed and sheltered by the Allies, or they're Nazi collaborators and war criminals, and we've got to send them home for justice. The British and the Americans say no. The Cold War has already begun. And the British and the Americans say, we will not send back any refugee who doesn't want to go. Period. End of story. The Russians refuse to, the Soviets refuse to support the displaced persons. The Americans and the British are left in their zones to set up the displaced persons camps to take care of them. and they do so.
Okay, so you've got all these people in these camps, and it's the army personnel who are handling the problem. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's the UK and US taxpayer, they are funding this. And quite a few people are beginning to complain that it's costing money and the troops are there for other duties, etc., etc. As I recall from your book, charitable organizations would have been happy to come along and help, but they were turned down at the beginning anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, there was such chaos. There was such anarchy in Germany. I mean, when Hitler commits suicide, everything ceases in Germany. There are no police. There are no deliveries to stores. There's no social services. It is the Americans and the British who have to feed, shelter a devastated people. They also have to weed out the Nazis and the war criminals and take them to justice. And they have to figure out who are civilians, who are innocent drafted soldiers, and who are the war criminals who must be punished. In the midst of all this, the last thing the Allies want is representatives from from American and British Jewish agencies coming into Germany and contributing to the chaos, they believe. So in June, July, and August, the Jewish displaced persons are left on their own with no special help from the Joint Distribution Committee, from the British aid and assistance organizations. And worse than that, not only are they left on their own, but neither the Americans nor the British recognize the Jews as a distinct national group. So if you are a Polish Jew, you are put into a camp with non-Jewish Poles. If you are one of the few remaining Lithuanian Jews, you are put into a camp where 10% of the people in the camp are Jews, 90% are non-Jewish Lithuanians, some of whom may have contributed or participated in the slaughter of your relatives. In 1945, the only ones who were looking after the Jews in particular are a group of chaplains, some from the British Army, most from the American Army. And they begin to write home, to write to Truman, to write to their congregations at home, to write to their local newspapers, and to say something must be done to rescue the Polish Jews who are trapped in camps with anti-Semite Poles. And eventually the World Jewish Congress and a variety of other groups arrange to get their message through Henry Morgenthau, who was a Jew and a member of Truman's cabinet, to Truman. And Truman sends a representative, Dean Earl Harrison, who had been a dean of the Pennsylvania Law School, to investigate what's going on in the displaced persons camps. And Dean Harrison writes a report, and in that report, he says to Truman, we are treating the Jews as badly as the Nazis did, except we're not exterminating them. We're putting them in camps where they are mistreated and underfed and undernourished. And there are no Yiddish speakers to support them. And the leaders of those camps are non-Jewish Poles or Lithuanians. And Harrison says the only solution for the problem of the Jewish displaced persons is to send them to Palestine. Those who want to go. 90% of the survivors do not want to go home again. Let them, those who want to go to Palestine, go to Palestine. And Truman confronts first Winston Churchill and then Prime Minister Clement Atlee. And he says to them, my special emissary has sent me this report, and we ask that you open the gates of Palestine to the Jewish survivors. And Truman says to the British Foreign Office and the Prime Minister, he says, you don't have to worry about millions of Jews going to the Middle East and Palestine because 6 million have been killed. We're talking about maybe 100,000 here. And Truman asks Atlee to open up, to grant visas to 100,000 Jewish survivors. And may I read Atlee's response? This is in September 16th, 1945, the British Prime Minister says that the British government would forever, quote, avoid treating the Jewish DPs on a racial basis. One must remember, this is Atlee speaking, that within these camps were people from almost every race in Europe, and there appears to have been little difference in the amount of torture and treatment they had to undergo. If we had placed the Jews in a special racial category at the head of the queue, my strong view is the effect would have been disastrous for the Jews. And therefore we treat them like everybody else because they suffered like everybody else. And then he concludes, in the case of Palestine, we have the Arabs to consider as well as the Jews. And Truman pushes further. He's not giving up. And Prime Minister Ernest Bevin, a true anti-Semite, I don't know that Atlee was, Bevin certainly was. Bevin says in November of 1945, quote, I am very anxious that Jews should not in Europe overemphasize their racial position. I want the suppression of racial warfare. And if the Jews with all their sufferings want to get too much at the head of the queue, you have the danger of another anti-Semitic reaction through it all. So what the British are essentially saying is, no, we're not going to do anything special for the Jews, anything special at all. We are not even going to allow them in their own camps. In the American zone, Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, the head of the occupying army, move all the Jews into their own camps. Atlee and Bevin refused to do that in the beginning, in the British zone.
Right, so you've explained the British position. Why not say a little bit about the resistance? Because the British thought the Americans should take these people, and that was easier said than done. What was the problem there?
Yeah, you asked the right questions. What the British say, what Bevin said directly, and he got a lot of criticism for it. He says, the Americans want us, nobody wants the Jews. He said, the Americans want us to open the gates of Palestine because no one in New York wants them, or Washington, or any place else in the United States. And he was right. He shouldn't have said it, but he was correct. The American Congress waited 3 years before it passed a bill authorizing special visas for displaced persons to enter the United States of America. On June 6th, 1945, the bill was passed. But that bill was written in such a way that 90% of the Jewish survivors in the displaced persons camps were barred, were ineligible to receive these visas. Why? Because we forget or we don't quite understand that 90% of the Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust, the Shoah, survived because they escaped into the Soviet Union, where they spent 3, 4, 5 years at hard labor, but they lived, they survived. And when the war was over, they came back to Poland, and they discovered in Poland that the anti-Semitism was worse than it had been before the war. And they discovered that there was no place for them in Poland, that their lives were in constant danger if they remained in Poland. This is in 1946. And what did the Polish Jews do? They smuggled themselves across borders into Germany. Why? Because only in Germany, behind barbed wire in American camps, did they believe they would be safe. And when the Americans pass a bill authorizing visas for displaced persons, they exclude the Polish Jews because, having survived in the Soviet Union or having lived in Poland, they were suspicious. They were subversives. The American Congress resurrected the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory that had been a favorite of Adolf Hitler. And in June of 1948, when Congress passed the Displaced Persons Bill, it said that anyone who entered Germany in the camps in 1946, and that's 200,000 Jews, were ineligible to receive these visas. Now, if you bear with me for a moment, I'm going to try to show you a photograph. This is a photograph, I hope you can see it. This is a photograph of Polish Jews in Salzburg, Austria, where they had escaped across the border. As you can see, they're younger and they're healthier because they did not survive in the camps, but in the Soviet Union. And so many of them, tens of thousands, crossed from Poland to Czechoslovakia into Austria, where the Americans put them up in these camps, as you can see, and then allowed them to move into Germany. Okay, what an extraordinary irony of history that the only place that the Jewish survivors felt comfortable was in Germany, because there they were protected from anti-Semitic violence by the American army.
Right. Another interesting aspect is that the Americans do decide they will take people, but they rig the procedure, as you indicated, and in so doing, they give preference to people from the Baltics and perhaps the Ukraine, Canada, I can think of, and they don't seem to screen them all that effectively. So what happens? Among the people who are screening the people are American and British officials who think they may be useful, some of these displaced persons, engaging in intelligence activities against the Soviet Union. And I found, reading around the topic, that among the people who were doing the interviews was someone called John Le Carre. who was
Yes.
a young diplomat before he became a novelist. So what happened there?
Yeah, and Le Carre developed his very cynical view of the British Foreign Service and its lack of understanding of justice, its betrayal of its virtues, or its betrayal of what its stated virtues were supposed to be. What happens is that if you remember when I described the displaced persons, the last million, there were tens of thousands of Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, and Ukrainians who had collaborated with the Nazis in their countries and had escaped into Germany and then disguised their past and gotten into the displaced persons camps. When questioned by the British and the American army, they said, oh, we don't have any papers, we don't have any passports, we don't have any, but we were farmers. They disguised their past as auxiliary policemen, as members of the Waffen-SS, the Latvian division or the Estonian division, as people who had served in the German occupying governments, okay? They made their way into displaced persons camps, and then they made their way into the nations of the world that had a severe labor shortage. In Britain after the war, there was a severe shortage of nurses, of hospital workers, of miners, of manufacturers, because Britain had lost, tens of thousands of men in the war. So what the British Home Office did was it sent recruiters into the displaced persons camps to select able-bodied, strong men and women to come work in the hospitals, in the mines, in the mills. And the first choice of the British Home Office and the Foreign Office were the Latvians. Why? Because they were virulently anti-communist at the beginning of the Cold War. Two, they had lived good lives in Latvia until the end of the war. They were healthy. They came from good families. They were Christian. One of the stories I tell in my book, which I still find extraordinary after all the years I did doing this research, was that at one point, the British bring into the UK Latvian, who they put in the mines. And the Latvians who were in the mines, the displaced persons, Latvians, work alongside British coal miners. And the British coal miners discover that the Latvians have SS tattoos under their arms. Everyone who was a member of the SS got a blood mark tattoo that was visible. And the British miners questioned these guys, and they discovered that working among them are members of the Latvian Waffen-SS. And they go to the Home Office and they go on strike. And the coal board goes to the Home Office, and the Home Office goes to the Foreign Office, and they have a huge meeting. And what decision do they come up with? Well, we'll continue to bring in the former Latvian Waffen-SS men into Great Britain, but from this point on, we will put them in jobs where they don't have to take off their shirts, so no one will see their tattoos. It is a shameful, shameful forgetting of history. What was more important to the British government and the American government in 1946 and 1947 and 1948 was not that these men had been war criminals and Nazi collaborators, but that they were now anti-communists. And they would spread a virulent anti-communism in whatever communities they were resettled in. And the British quickly discovered that their spy networks, the British had the world's greatest spy networks, and they had been destroyed after World War II. They had to be rebuilt. And who better than displaced persons to train in Britain and then send back to Latvia, to Belarus, to the Ukraine, to work for the British intelligence officers. The Americans did the same thing. The CIA did the same thing. They just weren't as good in their recruitment as the British.
This will be, I think, perhaps my last question. We can then open it up. The topic of displaced persons is with us to this day. I think of Syrians, where again, Moscow doesn't work together with London and Washington. We've got parts of Asia and so on. But coming to Palestine, I see that you have made what I describe as the discomforting observation that, quote, the problem of the displaced Jews is solved by the displacement of Palestinians with no sign of their ever being repatriated or resettled, unquote. When I think of what's going on this very week in Israel, I ask you, do you despair, David? Has the international community learnt nothing?
Yes, I'm afraid it has learned nothing. What happens in the end is that in 1948, 1949, 1950, Harry Truman realizes that in order to fight the Cold War effectively, and in order to rebuild Europe, Germany has to become, West Germany has to become an independent nation that will contribute to NATO, that will contribute to the Marshall Plan, that will stand as a bulwark against communism. But in order to establish a West German nation that's independent, Truman understands that he's got to get the displaced persons out of Germany, that you can't possibly say to the world, we, the Americans and the British, are going to end the occupation. But by the way, there are 250,000 Jews who are in camps, and they're now going to be under German law, and they're now going to be regulated by the German police. And if they do something bad, go to German jails. Truman recognizes that he's got to get the Jews out. The British have abandoned Palestine, given it to the UN to decide its future. And Harry Truman supports the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab sector. And then when that becomes impossible, in large part because of the British, that's another story, Truman recognizes that having failed to get Jews into the United States, and because Britain and Belgium and South Africa and Canada and Australia and Argentina and the nations of the world have chosen to bring in Latvians and Poles and Yugoslavs, but not Jews, into their countries for resettlement, that the only way that he can get the Jews out of Germany is to support the establishment of an independent nation in Israel. So minutes after Ben-Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence and proclaims Israel an independent nation, Truman recognizes the state of Israel. 55,000 of the 250,000 displaced persons end up in the United States getting special displaced persons visas. The remaining 150, 170, 200,000 go to Israel. 1/3 of the Israel Defense Forces that fights in 1948 is displaced persons. 1/3 of the casualties and the deaths are of displaced persons. And where do these displaced persons, where are they resettled? The vast majority are resettled in homes, apartments, on farmland and rural settlements that had once been occupied by the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs. There is and has been controversy on why the Palestinians left. Did they leave because of the war, because they were afraid? Did they leave because the Arab leaders said leave? From my point of view, it doesn't quite matter. What matters is that Ben-Gurion and the Israeli cabinet decided in 1948, and they told the first American ambassador to Israel that we will not let the Palestinians in until there's a formal peace treaty with every Arab nation, which they knew wasn't going to happen. So the Palestinians were refused re-entry to their homes. And to make sure that that would never happen, displaced persons were sent to occupy those homes. Let me just tell one final story. The displaced persons did not choose to displace Palestinians. They had no choice in the matter. And when they did, they made decisions that they were not going to engage in this. There is a story that is told about a couple who were resettled in Haifa, and they were taken to an apartment, and as they opened the door to the apartment, they saw that it was fully furnished. And they realized what had happened. And they turned around and walked out and said, we will found our own lodging. The problem, the horrible tragedy of the Jewish DPs who were resettled in Israel led to a second tragedy. The Jewish DPs had been displaced persons for 5 years. We are now going into our third generation, 70 years of displacement of the Palestinian refugees. And it seems to me that there is no end in sight, certainly not in my lifetime will I see the end of the Palestinian refugee crisis.
Thank you very much, David. Susan, I think we'll pass over to you.
Thank you both of you. David, fascinating. I'm sure most of the audience can't wait to read the book. Your research must have, I'm going to start off with a question by asking how long the research took you for the book.
You know, I got a letter in 2020 by someone who said, I'm a fan of your work. And every 6 years you've been publishing a big biography, and you should have published one in 2018. What happened? Well, what happened was that the research for this book took me to archives virtually and through research assistants in some places. In Great Britain, I spent a large amount of time in Kew, the British National Archives. There were papers and documents in Paris, all through the United States, in Jerusalem, in Germany. The research was extraordinary and extraordinarily rich. The Shoah archives with testimony from Holocaust survivors that Steven Spielberg, the director, assembled. The material at Yad Vashem and at the US Holocaust Museum and at the Imperial War Museum in London, and throughout the world were extraordinary. And I felt, to do justice to this problem, I had to read and read and read and read and read some more, and find research assistants, graduate students who knew German and who knew Polish and who knew Ukrainian and Hebrew and Yiddish to help me on my journey. So it took a full 8 years before the book was ready to be submitted to my publisher.
Okay. Okay, so I've got quite a few questions and comments in chat, so I will run through them. Somebody's message to say 6 years ago they received news that an aunt who they believed had died was still alive. They received the information from the Owlson archives. They then looked into the matter, and actually what had happened was her identity had been purchased by another young woman living in a DP camp in the 1940s. Somebody apparently was selling identities for 600 Deutschmark. And in this particular case, the identity of a dead German girl helped a young Romanian woman get to the USA. This person would be very interested to know whether you've heard of this before and whether there's some way to look into it. Did you find any information in any particular source?
Yeah, what happens is in December of 1945, when Prime Minister Atlee and Foreign Secretary Bevin had made it clear that they were not going to allow any surviving Jews into Palestine, Truman issues a directive. And under that directive, Truman says, we are going to give preference to the displaced persons, but preference within quotas established by the American Congress. Those quotas had thousands and thousands of places for Germans and a handful of places for Poles, so that every displaced person who could claim to be German could get one of those visas, right? So dozens, hundreds of Polish Jews, Romanian Jews, Jews from all over Eastern Europe forged documents claiming that they were Germans so that they could get visas in 1945. The 1948 law was an emergency law outside the quota system so that Poles and Lithuanians could enter this country. But until 1948, the only way to get into this country was through the quota system. And the only way to get a place in that line was to claim that you were German.
Okay, so the person who sent me that message, if you want some more information or you want me to try and put you in touch with anyone, if you email us at AJR, we will certainly do our best to...
Well, let me do it right now.
Yeah.
My email is, and I'll also give it to you to put in the chat. It's D Nasaw, DNASAW, at gc.cuny.edu. That's
Okay.
D Nasaw, my name, at GC, which stands for Graduate Center, .cuny, City University of New York, .edu. And I'd be happy to answer any of the questions. Well, you know, one of the things that came up in my research is that the Jewish refugees, the only conceivable way to get into the United States was to lie, to manufacture false papers. The Polish DPs, the Polish Jews who had spent time in the Soviet Union, made up new papers. A man named Joseph Berger, who was an editor and a writer at the New York Times, when he was 21 years old and was applying to graduate school, had to produce a birth certificate. So he went to his mother and he said, "Mom, where's my birth certificate?" And his mother said, "Well, Joey, sit down. I got to talk to you." And Joey sat down and his mother said, "Joey, we've always told you you were born in Germany, in the displaced persons camps, but you were really born in the Soviet Union, and you're 2 years older than we've told you." So Joe Berger, he says, "Why for 21 years have you lied to me?" And they said, "Well, we lied to you because we thought if we said you were born in the Soviet Union, that it would be harder to get you into the United States because people would, you know, claim that we were Soviet spies." Esther Safran Foer, F-O-E-R, who's recently written a book, had the exact same situation. She was born in Poland, but her parents said she was born in Germany. Why? So that they could more easily get a visa. The Jews are, you know, the Jewish survivors are an incredible group of people. They mourned the dead, but more than that, they did everything they could to keep alive the Jewish people, the Jewish heritage, the Jewish religion, the Jewish culture. And in order to do that, they had to lie. They had to forge papers. And they did so willingly and without remorse, because they did not want to remain in Germany more than a minute longer than was necessary.
Okay. So the next question is, a significant number of Jews did escape or migrated into Soviet Russia early in the war. Many were attracted to communism before they left. Did any join or were recruited into the Red Army? And did any of them feel disillusioned with the regime and choose to return to the West?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Large numbers of Jews joined or were forced to join, had no choice but to join the Red Army. And during the war, Stalin's attitude towards the Jews was very different than it was after the war. During the war, the Jews were welcomed as fighters against the Nazis. And Yiddish poetry was published. There were a large number of Polish and Latvian and Lithuanian Jews who were honored by the Soviets. Once the war was over, that ended. And the number of Jews who remained communists or remained faithful to the Soviet Union and to Soviet communism dwindled to a very small number. Why? Because like Clement Atlee and Foreign Secretary Bevin, Stalin refused to recognize the Jews as a separate people. There were no ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. Everybody was a socialist and a member of the Soviet Union. And Zionism was, for Stalin, a competing ideology, and he wanted nothing to do with it.
Okay. Now, somebody's actually mentioned something. You mentioned Clement Atlee. Actually, Atlee's family took in 2 Kindertransport children, and about 4 or 5 years ago, AJR had an event where they reunited the grandson of Atlee with actually the gentleman who was taken in by the family as a kinder. So somebody wanted me to point that out to you.
No, I appreciate that. Atlee was, as I said when I mentioned Atlee, he was not an anti-Semite. Bevin was. I think Atlee was trying his best to maintain Britain's role as a world power. And in order to do that, Britain was going to give up India, and did give up India. Didn't have support or in Egypt. It had lost its empire. But Atlee believed that it had to maintain relationships with the Arabs, not only for Arab oil, but to maintain its a soft empire. Bevin was a different question, different personality altogether. So I appreciate that reminder.
Okay. So I said you'd get a good response from our audience. Question, what did the diaspora do for the displaced persons rather than like the Jewish community in general?
In the beginning, well, how can I put this? The Jewish organizations in Britain and in the United States were able and were willing to give support to the Jews in the displaced persons camps, and did. They raised money, they sent food, rations, educators, newspapers. They did everything they could for the Jews in the camps. But what they did not do was to lobby their governments to allow those Jews to leave the camps and resettle in the UK or in the US. Canada was an exception. Canada let in a number of Jews because the Canadian Jewish community was, for reasons I don't fully understand, more committed to resettling Jews, and used all of its political influence to do so. Neither the organized American Jewish community or the organized British Jewish community used their influence. And why not? Because they were terrified of anti-Semitism. They were terrified of stoking the fires of anti-Semitism after the war. And they thought by advocating for the resettlement of Jewish DPs in either the UK or the United States, they would provoke the anti-Semites.
Okay. We'll always have a few controversial questions, and we're not ones to hide behind that at AJR. One gentleman wants to know, I'm just trying to read, sorry, there's so many questions on chat, I'm trying to get through them all. When did the world realize what actually happened to the Jews, that they became the narrative of the Holocaust today rather than the 10 million displaced persons? Because it's
Yeah,
saying.
it's a great question. One of the things that I was, again, horrified to discover in the course of my research was that on Liberation and at the end of VE Day, there was very little attention paid either in the UK or the US to the Jewish survivors. There were dozens and dozens and dozens. Eisenhower invited British journalists, British radio commentators, British politicians, American politicians, radio commentators, newspaper publishers, writers and editors to visit Dachau and Ohrdruf with him to see, and Buchenwald, to see what the Germans had done. The reports and the newsreels that came, and the radio broadcasts that came out after those visits did not talk about the Jews. They didn't. They talked about, the French and the Polish and the Russians and a couple of Americans and the prisoners of war and the political prisoners. But there was no emphasis on the fact that 6 million Jews had been killed. In the United States, I think the Holocaust consciousness, Holocaust education doesn't really begin until the Eichmann trial. And I think the same is probably true in the UK. I mean, the war was over. The war was over, and people tried to forget it and move on. And the Holocaust survivors, when the war was over, they wanted to talk. They wanted the world to know what had happened. And they published journals and diaries and newspapers. And they spoke to interviewers, and no one listened. No one listened. So they kept quiet. And they didn't talk to their children. They didn't talk to the newspapers. It was only when their grandchildren asked them what happened during the war. It was only in the last couple of decades since the Eichmann trial, and certainly from the 1980s on, that Holocaust consciousness reaches the general public.
I think that's very true. I think that's something we are so aware of at AJR, and I can see the screens of everyone, and I can see so many of our members nodding along to that last statement. Somebody has mentioned the Canadian Jewish community, who apparently did sponsor Jewish refugees, but the Canadian government was anti-Semitic as well. And this person has quoted, "Jewish refugees got permission to enter Canada only after the end of the war. And one of the top government officials said about the Jewish community, none is too many." And that's
yeah, that's absolutely the case. That's absolutely the case. But the difference is that the Canadian Jewish community, unlike the American Jewish community, fought and fought and fought and fought. And the Canadian Jewish community fought to keep the Nazi collaborators out and to get the Jews in. And most of the Jewish displaced persons who entered Canada did so under a special Canadian law that gave preference to relatives of Canadian citizens. And because there was an small but established Jewish community in Canada, they were able to bring in displaced persons who were related to them in some way or another. But the Canadian government was not in any way a friend of the Jewish people.
okay. I think I've pretty well covered all the questions. I'm sorry if anyone's got any other questions. As always, we always get to a point where we run out of time, and certainly with such a fascinating topic and discussion. I'm going to thank both of you. I'm going to let Martin have the last word, but I'm just going to read out a thank you from someone, which I think probably sums up what everyone in the audience feels today. So thank you, David, for a simply fascinating talk on a subject that we knew very little about. Well researched and beautifully communicated, and wonderful to hear you speak. And I think that probably sums it up, but I'm going to let Martin have the last word. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, this event will be on our YouTube channel probably the middle of next week. By all means, be in contact with us at AJR if there's anything we can do to assist or any more information you will need. I have popped Deborah and I both popped David's email address onto the chat facility. David, thank you for joining us from New York. You're going off to have your lunch now. And or those of us in the UK are probably going off for dinner. Martin, thank you for your well-researched questions. I wouldn't expect any less from you. And I will leave the last word to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, to Deborah, for organising this. I'd also like to say a thank you to someone who I think has been watching, and that is Lillian, who works at the AJR, and it is the person who I deal with most of the time. And it's Lillian who I pester, saying, could you please get me a review copy of this and of that? And so far, she has always been extremely obliging. Thank you again, Lillian. David, I'm very pleased that I've, so to speak, met you. I think you're a brilliant educator. I can see that. You get your points across extremely well. I think it's a good topic, and I'm glad we had a good turnout. I hope we can keep in touch and perhaps follow this up with something else in the near future. Many thanks again.
Thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you. As you are aware, AJR have Zooms most days of the week between Monday and Thursday. So we look forward to seeing you on future Zooms. And thank you again, Martin and David, for your time this evening.